Hello everybody and welcome to another Twilight Zone review. Today it is Season 5, Episode 31, The Encounter, written by Martin M. Goldsmith and starring Neville Brand as Fenton and George Takei as Arthur. And I would imagine that The Encounter was a pretty edgy episode when it aired in the mid-60s. It's also considered pretty controversial in some respects, and I have to say that although this is not a terrible Twilight Zone episode, elements of it haven't dated that well, and there's an odd mix of character study and a supernatural element to this episode that don't really work for me, and it does bring the episode down somewhat. So we start with one of our lead characters, Fenton, and he's cleaning some things up, and he comes across a sword, and he looks at it quickly, he examines it, and then he throws it to the side, but it will be very important to the episode. And then our other lead character, Arthur, comes by. Now, he goes by many different names in this episode, Taro and some other names, and it's a little bit confusing, I think, so I'll just call him Arthur for the sake of this review. And he says, I heard you need somebody to work on your lawn, so they agree to terms on that, and Fenton asks him, why don't you stay for a while if you're in no hurry? So Arthur reluctantly stays, and Fenton kind of kids him. He asks him about the sword, if he can translate it. And Arthur says, I can't read it, so you can tell that Fenton has some stereotypes, like this guy should be able to read it because of his ethnic background. And at this point, Arthur picks up the sword, and he kind of gets this weird vibe from it, and later that would be very important. And this is where the episode gets kind of strange. The supernatural element is kind of confusing and inconsistent throughout this episode, and you're not really sure when it's working and when characters are just acting on their guilt. So that didn't totally work for me. So we find out after the opening narration that it's been 20 years since Pearl Harbor. That will be important. And there's some more talk between the two men, Fenton and Arthur, and there's a lot of tension. And we also hear that Arthur doesn't like being called boy. He finds it offensive, and I would have to agree. And I will say I do like the way some of Fenton's dialogue was written, how he just uses these kind of terms and thinks nothing of it. I thought that was pretty realistic. He doesn't realize that he's being offensive. So they talk more, and the sword comes up again. And Fenton talks about how he doesn't believe in anything supernatural, but he can't get rid of this sword. It always comes back, meaning he tries to give it away, and somehow he always ends up with it. And he offers it to Arthur, who says, he wouldn't want it. And then we do find out that Fenton knew what the sword says, and it says, the sword will avenge me. That will be important at the end of the episode. So then there's just some more talking that goes on, and they start arguing a little bit, and Fenton talks about work, and he basically belittles Arthur and acts like his job is superior, or the job that he did have, as we'll find out later. And then Fenton starts talking about the war. He gives his story, but we're not 100% sure that it's all true based on what will happen later. It's very hard to deduce what's true and false at times in this episode, which I think is the point. I will say that the acting in this scene is very, very good, and the story is interesting. So at this point, I'm not really sure the reason, but Arthur comes at Fenton with the sword, and then he later apologizes. He says, I don't know what came over me. So this sword definitely is causing some of this to happen. And then Arthur comes to the conclusion that Fenton lied, that he actually killed a man who had already surrendered, and that's how he got the sword. So Arthur says, I think I better leave now, as he's starting to get worked up and upset, but it turns out that the door is stuck. So we go to the next scene after this, and there's some more threatening words, and then we get Arthur's story, and basically he talks about how his father was a war hero, but I'm not going to go into the whole story because we'll find out this wasn't really true. We then find out that Arthur made this up. He's really upset because his father was a traitor who helped the enemy. Now, as you can imagine, this backstory was considered to be very controversial, and it is thought to be one of the reasons that this episode was not talked about very often or aired very often on TV. And I have to say, I know it's a fictional story, the Twilight Zone episode, but I think they probably should have gone with a different backstory here that could have been just as effective. So after this happens, we hear Fenton's story, and he says his wife left him, he lost his job, and he basically makes some excuses for this, but ultimately it's his fault. And then he insults Arthur again, and he basically dares Arthur to kill him because he says he's alone and he really doesn't care to go on anymore, which seems a little over the top. It just kind of comes out of nowhere. Is the sword doing all this? It's kind of unclear. So after too many insults, a fight does break out, and ultimately after a struggle, Arthur does kill Fenton, and then he feels guilty about it, and he basically does himself in by going out the window. And Rod Serling talks about how guilt is what did both of these men in, which is fine, but ultimately I just don't feel like the character study part and the supernatural part of this episode go that well together. It's kind of all over the place. There's some good scenes of dialogue. There's some scenes of dialogue I don't care for. And ultimately, I would consider the encounter to be an interesting failure. It's not a terrible Twilight Zone episode. There's some thought behind it, but it just didn't work for me. And I give the encounter a 2 out of 5. Might be an episode worth watching once because it is kind of unique and different, even if ultimately I thought it was uneven. So a 2 out of 5 for the encounter. And as always, thank you very much for watching.